Hey guys, welcome to our lecture on early empires. I'm going to start by saying I'm not really going to be talking to you guys too much today. As we go through these slides, you're going to see a pattern of information that you're going to want to run through the Conrad Demarest model and Bodex model that we talked about before the weekend. If you can do this on your own, certainly there's not much of a reason to listen to anything I have to say. And you can pause the slides and go at your own pace. There aren't too many key concepts for this section either. Really, all I want you guys to be able to do is compare these empires using the models you were given. The details about individual empires are not nearly as important as figuring out how they're similar, how they're different, and how they fit with the models. There'll be a lot of comparison questions on the active vote quiz. The one question I do want you to pay attention to, though, besides just running the empires through the models, is how do empires facilitate cultural diffusion? If you had Miss Duddles last year, you know what this is. It's the spreading of culture from one area to another. If you didn't know what this is, you definitely want to be aware of this term. Some other terms you want to be aware of. Obviously know what an empire is, what the definition is. I'll go over that in a second. Know what these two types of empires are, what these two styles of leaderships are, and understand these terms as well. These last two, as well as the two before it, are going to be only in Spodek. Okay, so like I said, we're talking about the rise and fall of early empires today. I don't have an end date up here because there are some folks who still believe that there are modern empires still in existence. So depending on your definition of empire and your understanding of the word, you might believe that we're still in a phase of imperialism today. This relates to the first part of Chapter 5 of Spodek, by the way. I like to start with this picture because, like I just said, empires facilitate cultural diffusion. We see these pyramid-style tombs here. And when most of us think of pyramids, we think of Egypt. But these pyramids are actually in Sudan, which, as many of you guys will remember from last year, is directly south of Egypt. So what are pyramids doing in Sudan? How did they get there? Where did the idea to build these come from? Well, it comes from Egyptian influence. As Egypt spread its cultural influence south, as it expanded its empire, they influenced the people there. That's why you see these Egyptian-style pyramids with a slight difference on it. The folks from the Nubian Empire, which is what existed in Sudan at that time, kind of put their own touch on it and change things up a little bit, but you can clearly see the influence of Egyptian architecture here as there's cultural diffusion from north to south. What themes are we going to be talking about for this section? Well, certainly a lot of theme 3, right? That's where empires are found. And empires like to grow, they like to expand. That's the state expansion part of theme 3. But certainly cultural diffusion is part of theme 2, and we'll see some other themes as well. Okay, so there's many different definitions of empire out there, but the one I like is this one: several peoples, nations, or states under the control of a single ruler or ruling group. It's kind of like many different ethnicities or ethnic groups or racial groups under the control of one specific racial or ethnic group. I like to actually use Star Wars to remember that. If you guys are familiar with the movies, there's a galactic empire, right? Lots of different alien races under the control of, in this case, one evil leader, right? If you're not a Star Wars fan, that's okay. You can remember the definition on your own. So you guys started reading Spodek before we left for the weekend, and you saw what his model was all about. But this is sort of a compacted version of that model. So take a look at this. If you had trouble understanding what Bodex Framework was from the textbook, this might be an easier way to understand it. I'll let you pause the video and look over this on your own time. This is Bodex Framework for Why Empires Fail. Again, along with the first slide, go ahead and pause the video, take your own time to review it, and think about how both of these slides compare with the Conrad Demarest model you got before the weekend. Alright, let's get started with our empires. First one was created in Mesopotamia by this guy, Sargon of Akkad. How did he do it though? How did he manage to take over this area previously controlled by various Sumerian city-states? Well, think back to the city-states' relationship with each other. It was a violent one, right? They were always fighting. Made it easy for somebody to come in from the outside and take them over. And that's exactly what Sargon was able to do. How did he hold his power? Well, there are several guesses as to how he may have done this, but usually we see that successful emperors, successful empires, oftentimes hold power by adopting local customs, not really changing things too much. And we don't think that Sargon really changed things too much, so there wasn't too much resistance to his rule. In fact, the single leadership of all these territories, instead of the infighting that had happened over the years, could have led to economic prosperity. And so folks might have actually enjoyed having that single leadership, enjoyed having Sargon as their leader. That's not the only reason why we ought to care, though. Sargon sort of begins a trend of imperial dominance in Mesopotamia that's really going to continue almost unbroken until modern times. What themes we're talking about? Always going to be 3, right? And 2 as well, because he brings these cultures together. So what happens to the Akkadian Empire? Winds up getting defeated by outside invaders. This is going to be a pattern that we're going to see a lot of. And in this case, the Babylonians eventually come in after years of chaos and establish their dominance. What themes do you see here? And how well does the Akkadian Empire's story fit with Spodek's model or with the Conrad Demarest model? Take about 3 minutes and decide for yourself what you think. There's theme 3 again, and military defeat from Spodek's model. Also, the last part of the Conrad Demarest model really fits with where the Akkadian Empire goes. Babylonians don't last forever either. They get replaced by the Hittites, and Hittites who had superior military tactics, superior weaponry, were able to kick them out. Are we seeing a trend here? Same themes, military defeat yet again. If this is kind of a boring pattern, I'm sorry, but we're going to continue to see it over and over and over again. Here's some Hittite art, though. Some chariot warriors trampling over one of their enemies. We can see, I think, in this artwork what the Hittites valued in their culture. And a big part of their culture was combat, was conflict. Again, that's theme 3, right? Alright, I'm not going to read all this to you. I'll let you guys do that yourselves. But we're establishing a trend here, right? We're asking ourselves, how does the story of each one of these empires fit with the models we have? So take a look really quickly at the breakdown of Egypt and its first empire, and ask yourself, how well does it fit with the model? I'll let you pause the video and figure that out for yourself. Okay, so looking at Spodek's model, or looking at the Konrad Demarest model, there's a section about ideology, right? And people losing faith in the imperial ideology. One of the core beliefs of Egypt was that the pharaoh was a god. And when folks started to lose faith in the pharaoh's power, well, that created a problem for the empire. Leads to divisions within the empire and infighting. There's a section about internal rebellions, right? And that made it easier for outsiders to invade. There's that military defeat again. So hopefully you're seeing a trend here. Hopefully you're seeing a recurring patterns happening again and again and again. Okay, remember I said Egypt, the story of Egypt is that it divides, and then there's chaos, and then it reforms and expands, and then it divides again, breaks up, and then there's chaos, and then it reforms and expands. This is the second time it's done that. Divided once under the time period between the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, reforms under the Middle Kingdom, then it expands and divides again in that time period between the Middle and New Kingdom, then it reforms again and it expands again, and here we are with the New Kingdom. I'll give you your own time to read over this and ask yourself again those questions. Which themes do you see here? How well do you see this story fitting with the models that you should be getting increasingly familiar with? So what connections could you guys make to the models? Once again, we're looking at military defeat, right? Military defeat. Okay, let's go back to Mesopotamia and talk about the Assyrian Empire. There's their timeline. As you can see from Assyrian art, just like the Hittites, the Assyrians seem to be pretty into fighting, right? Combat is a big part of their culture. And there were plenty of other empires between the Hittites and the Assyrians, but we're not going to cover them because there's just too many and we don't have enough time. And as you can probably guess, the story about how those empires rose and fell is going to be very, very similar to the other stories we've just talked about. Before we talk about the Assyrians, though, let's get philosophical for a second. If you were a ruler, do you think it would be better to be loved or feared by your people? Now, when I ask students this question, they always say, well, can't we have a little bit of both? But I want you to choose one or the other. Okay, pick a side. If you had to choose all one or all the other, what would you say? And think to yourself why you made that choice. You can take 2 or 3 minutes to make that decision. So what did you say? Loved? Feared? I don't know which way is better, but the Assyrians definitely went with feared. The way that they conquered, the way that they treated people, struck fear into their conquered people's hearts. And I really want you guys to be familiar with these two terms from Bodex here. Hegemonic and dominant styles of rule. If you're not aware of what those are, take a look in your textbook right now and figure that out so that you can determine for yourself whether the Assyrians were hegemonic or dominant. So did you figure it out? Probably more dominant, right? Those folks who use fear and use intimidation to establish and solidify their rule, that's dominance. Hegemony or hegemonic rulers would be those who rule with a degree of support from the folks that they've conquered. Okay? So Assyrians went with the feared style of rule, or the dominant style of rule. And they were able to because they had a pretty impressive military. Do I care that you know these military tactics? No. They're interesting if you're into military history, but they're not that important. What you need to know about the Assyrians is that they were harsh, they were feared. And you should also know they really didn't control a very large area. My question to you guys is, why do you think that was so? Take a few moments, pause the video, and make your best guess. Well, there's something about treating people harshly, something about dominating them, getting them to fear you, that over time really also angers them. And even though the Assyrians had conquered a bunch of weaker nations with differences, those nations got together and said, hey, we might not like each other, but we hate the Assyrians even more. We should band together and kick them out. And eventually what happens is this guy right here, Cyaxares of Media, leads a coalition of weaker nations to kick them out. Eventually starts what becomes the Persian Empire. Do I care that you know about this guy? Not really. What I care about is that you know that dominant empires like the Assyrians, those who rule by fear, don't usually last as long or control as much territory as the empires that rule through hegemony, like the Persian Empire eventually will. So let's talk about the Persian Empire. If you guys think about Xerxes over here from the movie 300, when you think of Persia, he's not around just yet. You're not going to really see him until later. Okay, we're talking about the very early Persian Empire here. Once again, I'm not going to read this to you. I'm sure you guys can do that on your own. But I want you to take a look at the summary story of the Persian Empire, or at least the beginnings of the Persian Empire, and decide for yourself how well is this story fitting into the models that you're aware of. Good farmland, does that fit anywhere into the Konrad Demarest model or into Bodex model as a reason why the empire was able to start successfully? Good economic resources, does that fit anywhere? How about the quality of the leadership? Does that fit anywhere? As you guys are reading over this, you should notice that Persian Empire is a bit more hegemonic than they are dominant. They rule pretty much with the consent of the folks they conquer. They might not have been loved, but you know, at least they were not hated. This policy of hegemony gets interrupted, though, a little bit through the time period of the Persian Empire's reign. One of the leaders decides to terminate the policy of religious freedom and cultural acceptance in the territories it controlled. And not surprisingly, that policy of dominance, that policy of using outright power to crush your enemies, leads to hatred, leads to rebellion. But good news for the Persian Empire is that eventually the policies of religious freedom and cultural tolerance are reestablished, and that allows the empire to flourish again. Also, the empire starts building really impressive infrastructure. You really want to focus on this infrastructural achievement here. The Royal Road stretching, as you can see, thousands of miles here, from Susa to Sardis, two ancient cities that connected the heart of the Persian Empire with some of its outlying areas. That really helps to hold an empire together. An infrastructure that allows for communication. Speaking of infrastructure, speaking of communication, do you guys see that fitting anywhere into the Konrad Demarest model? Good empires facilitating communication, facilitating trade. You should find that somewhere. And the people who were under the Persian Empire believed that it was a good idea to be part of it, for the most part, because they couldn't have built something like this on their own. They needed a government bureaucracy to do that for them. But everybody under the empire, all of the more minor peoples living under that broader political umbrella, they all benefited from this sort of infrastructural improvement. So it was good to be part of the empire. And that's it for our lecture today. We'll talk about China in a little bit in a later chapter. Thanks for watching, guys.